Welcome to MyLife, Chassidus Applied, episode 27. This week, we will begin to address some new questions that have been coming in. I have many, and guaranteed for many months ahead. So please continue to send your questions to meaningfullife.com/MyLifeLive, completely anonymous. If you want to write to me personally, please write to Simon, S-I-M-O-N, at meaningfullife.com so I can respond to you. And being that our hearts and prayers are with our brothers and sisters in Israel, I'd like to begin again the Rebbe's suggestion a number of years ago in a similar situation that we should add and increase in prayer, in Torah, and in Tzedakah. In prayer, particularly the Kapitlach Tehillim 20, 22, and 69. In Torah, the laws connected to this period in time, which would be the 3 weeks, the Rebbe's Hera of learning Hilchos Beis HaBchira, the laws of the Beis HaMikdash, in the Rambam, as well as Masechta Midas, Tamid. Of course, based on the Psukim in Yecheskel that talks about the Beis HaMikdash HaShlishi. And the foundation of this is, as the Rebbe said many times, the Medrash, that when Yecheskel asked Hashem, how will we be consoled over the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, Hashem said, study the laws, study the measurements, study the details of the Beis HaMikdash, and it will be considered as if you're rebuilding it, which is a common theme in Torah, that kol ha'esuk b'Torah sa'ela, when you study something, since Torah creates existence, you therefore create it spiritually, and ultimately it leads to the creation physically, which is a result of the Torah's creation. Staka baraisa or bara alma, God looked into the Torah and created the world. We look in the Torah and we sustain the world. And in Tzedakah, to give additional Tzedakah both for Mosdus in Eretz Yisrael and Mosdus outside of Eretz Yisrael. This is how we strengthen Eretz Yisrael's power, the spiritual power of the Holy Land, of the Promised Land. We do this everywhere in the world, and we do our part. This isn't just a battle going on there. Each of us has to play our role in the work of rebuilding Eretz Yisrael, strengthening Eretz Yisrael, fortifying it in every possible way. So now let's go to some questions. As I said, I'll address some new questions as well as follow up on the previous ones that have yet to be answered completely, and so on. So let me begin with a question that last week we didn't have the time to answer. Help, I received bad advice from rabbis. And the question arises the following. Fear of aseh l'charav. When I was a teenager, a new Baal Tshuva, in a small town Chabad yeshiva that was struggling to survive, the Anhola, as the faculty found that I was a clever kid and actively pushed me to go to college. My understanding is and was that it was important to them to show future prospective parents that their alumni go on to be successful in college. I want to put that in context. A shliach of the Frierdiker Rebbe, and the Rebbe told me about tshuva of less than 3 years, who knew next to nothing about Judaism, etc., to not go to yeshiva and learn Torah full-time at 18, which was an option for me, but rather go to college instead. I was smart and capable enough to both have the secular education and the Torah learning. It was solely my own study of the Rebbe's words about college that stopped me from going. I knew they, the rabbis, were wrong and didn't listen. The situation was so extreme that one of my parents, who was pushing me to go to college, would say to me, the rabbis are telling you to go to college, why don't you want to go? With appeals to religion. It took me a while, 20 years to be exact, to realize it, but this implanted in me a total distrust of rabbis. There's literally only one that I really trust, the Rebbe. With everyone else, I am more concerned about what angle and negiyas they have, that's their subjectivity, their biases, and the idea of actually asking a question that has life implications is simply something I cannot bring myself to do. Burned once, twice shy, as they say. So besides the fact that I'm not exceptionally social and a good networker to find this good Rav in my life, even to the degree I potentially could, I simply cannot get myself there. Any advice? And there were several other questions in similar vein, different topics, where people, either as students or later in their lives, asked questions to particular rabbis, put their trust. Some wrote that the trust was betrayed. Things were said that broke confidentialities. Advice was given was not wise. And many so-called nightmare stories with Rabbonim, with Mashpiyim, with Mashpiyas, etc. It's a very good question, even though it may be an embarrassing one, but how can we not address it when the Rebbe himself made such a fundamental hira? As I've mentioned a number of times, Yutes Kislev Lamed Zayin, the Rebbe started Mashpiyim. Kisove Tovshim Mem Zayin, he started, Shabbos Devarim rather, Chazain, he started Ta'aseh L'charav. So this is a direct hira from the Rebbe, which is based, of course, on the hira of the Mishnah itself, Ta'aseh L'charav. And clearly, when we're given a directive, it means we definitely can fulfill it. But then you have all these stories. And when you get burned, you start not trusting. You're not trusting. How do you fulfill this? So it's one thing which we addressed in previous episodes, unable to find a Rav, which also needs to be done because, it's a directive and it's for our own benefit to be able to find an objective party. And I advise then, one of the ways to do it, you may not be able to find a Rav to all your issues, so different people are experts in different areas. And so at least, tafasta merubah tafasta, so start somewhere. Divide and conquer. Find an area that you can find someone that you can trust. Very often getting a referral from a friend says this is a good person to speak to about a particular type of topic is often a good way to start. But let's address now this bad advice from a rabbi. Now I have to divide this question into two. One, it touches upon this whole issue of secular education that we've been addressing, which I intend to continue later on in this episode. So I don't want to get into that right now, how someone could give that advice, whether it was misplaced. I wasn't there. I'm not sure what their basis was. Was it because he already had gone to college? It's not clear to me. But generally speaking, the Rebbe did give people suggestion or advice that if they're already in college to finish and get a degree, etc. So I'm not sure whether the rabbis did wrong or they didn't, and I don't want to judge anyone without knowing all the facts. Frankly, it's not so relevant to his question. His question is basically about trust. He ended up not trusting them. Now, I'm assuming that his feelings are correct. Because if the feelings are not correct, before you judge the Rav or Mashpia or Mashpia that gave you advice, maybe you're wrong. Maybe your judgment is wrong. So to say you didn't like their advice doesn't mean their advice was bad. So I need to qualify this, that every time something happens doesn't mean that always their advice is bad. Maybe you didn't like it, or maybe they weren't able to communicate to you well. So we need to distinguish between whether the advice was bad and was good and you couldn't receive it for whatever reason, or the advice wasn't good. So I'm going to address the latter. Because if it's the former, then it's a matter of simply finding someone else who maybe can clarify. Sometimes I know myself, I've gotten advice from someone. At the time I didn't appreciate it. Years later I appreciated the advice. But let's say the latter is true, which means you actually got advice that was not correct advice. In other words, assuming that you're correct, they gave bad advice. So listen, in life, this is what happens. This is the same case when people say, I fell in love, got married, and the marriage didn't work out, God forbid. So yes, the tendency is that you don't want to trust, you don't want to open up again because you were vulnerable and hurt. And the tendency is to retreat and protect yourself. But that's life. Life is adult life, that there are times we will be disappointed. You had a friend. The friend you thought you can trust, and then something happened. So you have to realize that life is not perfect, and maybe that was not the right friend. Maybe it's time to get another friend. So I believe this is the case. Aseh l'charav is a statement that's based on wisdom. We need to have someone objective to speak to, especially someone who knows Torah and knows you. The Rebbe would say often, his answer, go to a Yedid Mumche. I don't know if I've mentioned it on MyLife, but for me it's one of the most underused and underfulfilled hiras, directives of the Rebbe. Yedid Mumche. Find someone that's a mumche, an expert, but a yedid means a friend. So it's not just a lawyer or a doctor or an accountant or someone else, a psychologist, but somebody that knows you, plus expertise. So many people go to experts, but they're not yedidim. They're not friends. Many people go to friends, but they're not experts. So it's one of the most underused, and I read elsewhere somewhere that one of the most underused resources we have is going to close friends and relatives. We sometimes spend years and money to find an expert in something when someone right in your backyard, someone that you may know, someone that may even be a brother or a sister or a cousin, can give you as good as advice. Sometimes we go distant places. That's one of the most underutilized hiras of the Rebbe, which is a close cousin to Aseh l'charav and Mashpim, maybe not exactly, but the same idea. So if you didn't get good advice from someone, just think of it like if you got a bad lawyer. Made a mistake, or the lawyer didn't understand, find a different one. To get burned and say, I will never go again and never trust again, is not a mature approach. I'm not here to criticize. Someone who's been hurt has been hurt. But I think we have to simply sometimes step back, lick our wounds, and move on. It's in our own benefit to do so. So that's my answer to this. Are there many rabbis that don't give good advice? Absolutely. Are there many rabbis that are not even competent rabbis? Sure. We're not here to speak negatively about others. Each of us has to take care of ourselves. But if you're a mature adult, you have to surround yourself with people that do give you good advice. And if one doesn't work, you try someone else. In that famous sikh, Yutas Kislev, Tov Shalom Zayin, the Rebbe said, if people should volunteer to be mashpim, it's not a lifetime contract. Apes is gelungen, which means if they're successful, they will stay on. The proof is in the pudding. The customer is always right. So bottom line is, if you find someone that doesn't respond to your needs, find someone else. But the main thing is not to run from one to the next just to find a direction that you like. Because the whole point is to get advice that is not based on your own subjective biases. That's the general response to this, and everything is possible if we only set our minds to it. And you keep trying and you'll find what you have to find. Yes, unfortunately, we have many people who misrepresent and are not good representatives of what the Torah says, of what the Torah's message is, or they may know what the Torah says, but they don't have the common sense, the fifth Shulchan Aruch, to know how to apply it to given situations. And that's why we need friends and references and so on. Much more to say on this, but suffice with what I've said. I believe that this is something that addresses many different type of questions that are similar to this. Look, I for one have not minced words about critique of establishment or rabbis or people who think that they are experts. And we live in a world where the Torah says, "Mehechen dantuni," you can ask a rabbi, where did you get this from? In a respectful way, to be able to see whether it's based on something. You can go check with another. The Rebbe says about doctors, a doctor gives an opinion, go to another doctor. If there's a disagreement, go to a third one. So we live in a world where you can check, you can confirm, you don't have to follow blindly anything that's said, especially if something rubs you the wrong way. At the same time, we realize that we are all subjective, and at times we may not like a piece of advice. And that shouldn't be the reason we should reject the rabbi or the mashpia and so on. Let's go to another question. Accidental or intentional lapse. How can I have a tikkun for not eating chol v'yisrael? I mistakenly ate some in a restaurant that had both chol v'yisrael and non-chol v'yisrael. Obviously, I asked about it before, but for some reason, the person didn't understand that's what I wanted and gave me some non-chol v'yisrael and sampled to taste before I bought something. When I realized it was too late and felt horrible. How should I feel? What should I do? What is a tikkun? What did Rabbeim say on this? I was thinking to give more tzedakah because the Alter Rebbe says it's instead of fasting and a form of tshuva. Any insights? Another question in the same vein. My husband and I are very careful about maintaining a distance, Taharas Hamishpacha, especially when it's required of us. But what happens if you make a mistake, whether accidental or intentional? What if you learn something new about keeping the laws of Taharas Hamishpacha that you never knew or kept before? And you've been living that way for years. Can you please shed some light on this? And again, there are other questions, similar vein, a similar idea, where a person, there's a lapse, a mistake, intentional, not intentional. I want to do something about it. So interestingly, there's actually a hirosh from the Rebbe directly about both these questions, both chol v'yisrael and Taharas Hamishpacha, and actually kashrut in general, and many other things. And one consistent hirosh from the Rebbe, which is fascinating because it's a directive, is based on a Maimer Chazal, Kol hamispal ba'ad chaverei hu nenot chila, which means that when you're in need and you pray for someone else who has that need, hu nenot chila, you'll be answered beforehand. So what does that mean? It means when you have a lapse in a certain area, the way to do a tikkun is besides your own tshuva, besides your own increasing, being more careful in that area, as it says in the Rambam about hilchos tshuva, that tshuva means to go back to the same situation, the same place, and not do it again. The Rebbe's Hira is inspire someone else to be careful in that area. Someone who is not careful in Chol Yisrael, to become careful. Someone who's not careful in Kashrut, Rachmana litzlan, to become careful. Someone who's not so careful in Taharas Hamishpacha, or in particulars of it, to do that with them. Because then what's happening is, you would never have done that had you not had a lapse. So your lapse ends up not just you correct yourself, you're also helping another person. So you're literally filling a real tikkun, which means it's not just going back to where you were, which is like back to square one. You actually, the tshuva has created keflaim l'teshiyah, like he says in Tanya, that when a rope tears and you tie it with a knot that's doubly strong, if not more, than it was originally. So here you've used your so-called setback to become, your liability to become an asset where you've influenced another person. And this is a law that Rebbe said to a number of people. Some are well known, some privately, in all these areas. Taharas Hamishpacha, there are letters where the Rebbe says, if there's a lapse, influence others. It could be one person, it could be many, obviously. The more the merrier. The more the better. I don't know if merrier is the proper expression. But the point is, that's the way we correct it. And I saw even a note, I'll settle from the Rebbe, that was printed once in one of the publications. It was to a woman who had clearly gone through a difficult childhood. And she dealt with a lot of psychological issues. And especially in the area of abuse. And the Rebbe writes to her that one of the ways to fix something like that is to go into that field and help other women who deal with the same challenges. And I believe he brings the Hunan Atchila, the Maimer Chazal, that gives a deeper way. Because the Maimer Chazal, you could say, it's a zgula. You pray for someone else, and God blesses you in return in that kind. Or you can say it's more than just a zgula. It's actually Siba Masuba, cause and effect. Because we're all deeply connected. And when one person has suffered, another person has not, you can't see a commonality between the sufferer and the one who hasn't. So we can empathize, but how do you give advice to someone that you've never been in their shoes? But when you've experienced something, it creates a bond, not just in a positive way in good things, a bond between people who've suffered or have experienced similar forms of abuse, that you have the credibility and the experience that only you have, due to the loss or to the suffering or pain that you endured, to help another person in that area. And it's a tremendous idea, because what happens is it's a redemption. God forbid, it's not a justification. We all would rather not have it, but it's a redemption, because not only have you healed and been able to, let's say, transcend that issue and forget it or move on or build something positive in your life, you've actually used the experience that you uniquely have, like he says in Tanya Perek Zayin, Hoyel, Val Yodeh, when you talk about Zdeinis Naslei Kazachis, when someone did a crime, some sin, even an intentional one, because through it brought you to a deeper love, like a thirst that brought you to a deeper, like thirst that brought you to a deeper thirst for water. Therefore, it becomes like a Zachias Mamish. It becomes like transformed to a merit. So this is true psychologically, true in every area. And this can be applied, I believe, across the board in any situation where there's a lapse. And it's a tremendous way of redeeming something, and perhaps maybe the best way to heal at the end of the day. Because as much as one heals, it doesn't come close than when you actually use that which you suffered in to be able to help others. It's like turning the poison into a medicine. Meneyu be'aban lishde be'narga, as the Gemara and the Tanya brings from the Gemara and Sanhedrin, that to cut down a tree, you need the wood from the tree. Next question. Dealing with stress. Question number 1. Thank you for doing this amazing project. I was wondering if you can suggest ways of dealing with anger, stress. Whenever I am under stress, the crunch time of life or not, I tend to be more edgy, and the small things can push my buttons easily and cause me to lose my cool. This goes without saying at the time. I'm probably not thinking clearly either. I would really like to be more in control and to be able to hold my cool, or better, not just hold my cool, but not allow it to be built up to just lose it later. This is something I've been thinking about a lot lately, especially as I would not want this to affect my relationships with others. Good. Question number 2. I am very emotionally volatile and wear it on my sleeve. When something doesn't go the way I planned or anticipated, I fall into a hole of anger, stress, and frustration. Now that I'm married with children, it's very difficult. I'm the woman, and I know that my mood affects everyone around me. And I really need to help controlling myself, because sometimes I bring everyone down with my mood changes. Question number 3 in this category. How to not be affected by small, insignificant issues of life that really don't affect the real issues of life. I find that at times when we look at things, in the broader picture, usually after the fact or when it's not concerning me, rather someone else, me instead, rather someone else, we tend not to be concerned or bothered by the small insignificant things, being that the issue at hand loses its significance. I was wondering if there are ways I can train myself to either see things for myself at first glance with a broader view, or is there a way not to be bothered by the small things in life? Okay. As always, I need to begin with a qualification. Every case is different, and it's very difficult to answer a person who you don't see, who you don't know their circumstances, and you don't know whether these issues are simply simple, frustrating moments in life, or are symptoms of much bigger and deeper issues, which is always possible. I always want to assume it's less of a problem than it is, but you cannot, we have to be thorough. So I have to say that it's critical. If you really want an answer, I'll give you some general guidelines, but you must talk to someone personally. And I know I say it again and again, and people sometimes wonder why I say it again and again. Well, because it's important to hear, because if you really want to do something, you have to do it the right way. And the right way is we take general guidelines, which I shall definitely address from the Rebbe, from Chassidus, but you must talk to someone because it could be a sign of something deeper. There may be ways to handle it. You may have to deal with medical ways. There may be therapeutic ways. There may be simple ways. So all those need to be covered, and one cannot know. Every individual is different, and so on. So you have to ask yourself, first of all, if these are patterns that are long-term, or they just pop up once in a while. Are they something that pops up, for example, when someone's pregnant? Or does it come down in different circumstances? What triggers it? If you really want to get to the bottom of it, you need to answer that. Or is it something ongoing? That basically you have a short fuse and very edgy all the time, and anything can push your buttons. So these questions need to be answered to be an adequate, complete response. With all that said, let me give a few guidelines that we hear, and we've talked about this in previous episodes a while back when we dealt with anger management. From Tanya, the different advice in Tanya on the issues of anger in chapter 12, in chapter 25 in Igeres HaKedesh, and elsewhere. And generally speaking, you're dealing with a part of the general objective of our lives, which is to get control of ourselves. We called it cognitive, emotional, and behavioral conditioning. It's the basis of Tanya. How to train the mind, how to train emotions, emotionally, and how to train our actions. And all are necessary. Sometimes behavioral, it begins with behavioral. Sometimes it begins with cognitive. Sometimes it begins with emotional. Obviously, the easiest often is the behavioral because it's just acting. But sometimes that doesn't work because we just are triggered. So cognitive is very important in this regard, and so on. So if you're talking about really looking at your life in a serious way and not just some quick fix, that's the best way, is to simply begin focusing, just like when we do exercise. You begin walking every day. You begin eating diet and hygiene in a certain way. Here too, maybe it's time to look at your life, not just in the area where you get frustrated, but in general, what kind of control do you have over yourself? How do you react to things? The first step in doing this is sit down with someone that you trust and just say, here's how I react. How do you react to something? Compare notes. Look around and see the different ways that you can, that there may be alternatives. And by comparing notes, sometimes you say, so what do you do when you get angry? What do you do when you get frustrated? And you'll be fascinated to find out that your closest friends either have similar issues or they have ways to deal with it. Some people go for a walk. Some people read. Some people have different hobbies. They release tension through knitting. Some people release tension through some games, word games. There's crossword puzzles. There's all kinds of methods. I'm not suggesting everyone that does crossword puzzles or everyone that does any of these games necessarily has issues. But there are many ways to relieve tension and stress that are healthy, that are Alpi Torah, Alpi Chassidus, and Rishus. There are things that we do that relieve tension. Physical exercise, by the way, is a very big reliever of tension because tension builds up, creates knots in the body, and it's a way of freeing yourself. We'll get a massage, go into a spa, different ways that people can do this. If you do it in a way that's a planned, strategic way, not just waiting for the next time you have an explosion and say, what do I do? It's very hard to fix things in the middle of a storm. Ships have to be built strong before the storm strikes. When you see trees that fall in a hurricane, You can't do anything in the middle of the hurricane. You have to do it before. In the years of plenty, you prepare for the years of famine. In Joseph's great piece of advice. So if you're really serious about your life and you have these ongoing issues, take it seriously. Do something about it. Most likely, since you wrote to me about it, it means it's an issue. It's not just like you had a moment. It's probably an ongoing pattern. And there are ways to deal with it. I did not say it's not necessarily going to be solved, but here are ways. Because as soon as you defang the enemy, which means awareness is half the cure of every problem, shining the light usually chases away burglars and chases away enemies. Infections too. You shine the light, you expose it to fresh air, that's the healer. What is that? What is the equivalent of that in psychological terms? You talk about it to yourself, to others. Im yidag odom yasiach, the pasuk says. A person has stress, concerns, yidag daige, worries, yasiach. So the Gemara says yasiach means two meanings. One is yasiach from the word yasiach, sicha, speak about it. And number two, it's from the word hesach hadas, that's with a sin, this is with a samach. Distract yourself. The Rebbe Marash asks a question, is printed in the Igros Kodesh, and I believe I cited it in earlier episodes. He asks a big question. Isn't it a contradiction to push it away from your mind and to speak about it is the opposite. When you speak, you're dwelling on it. When you push it away, you're not dwelling on it. And his answer is brilliant. His answer is that by speaking about it, you free yourself. You release it. Remember, breaking the silence is a big force. So often talking about it, that helps weaken it. Not talking about it ad nauseum and obsessing and constantly in that sense and consumed by it, but freeing yourself by talking about it and somewhat relieving the tension in that way. People make a phone call to certain people that just have a calming influence on you. These are some general elements. More short-term, and short-term, as the word implies, anything that's short usually lasts short. Anything built overnight can fall overnight as well. So short-term, you have to find those little exercises, those little ways that work for you, that help you deal with things. And when you do have a lapse, and for whatever reason you fail at your effort, and you explode or in some other way, don't drive yourself guilty. Make it very clear that you'd want to do something about it. And some way document it and so on. Remember the big responsibility that you have, especially the one who writes that she's a woman in the home, that yes, everything you do impacts your children. So remember, how you're reacting, your children are going to learn is a legitimate way of reacting to situations like this. And that's important to remember. And maybe write it down for yourself actively in the morning, in the evening, to make sure that you're very careful. And even if you need to release some tension, find a way to do it that no one else has to be affected by it. You're about to scream or get angry or yell, maybe go into a different room. Find someone or find something. Maybe take a pillow and yell into your pillow. Showers are very good for this as well. There's all kinds of methods if you really apply yourself. And remember, the responsibility is great because how you impacts, and usually reciprocal. It brings out the worst in people when you act in this fashion. Another important thing I want to address is the general attitude that Chassidus and the Rebbe teaches us. We're not negligible, insignificant creatures. Our acts matter. When you know that you have value, and you know that every move you make and every action you take creates a ripple effect in your life and the life of others in existence, you're far more responsible. I think many of us stop valuing ourselves and our being devalued, being depersonalized, has a very negative impact because what happens is we become lax in our behavior. What do you mean lax in our behavior? That instead of focusing on what we should be focusing on, we allow ourselves to become lax. When a person considers themselves with dignity, just like you're in a bad mood, are you going to go outside dressed like you're in a bad mood? No, because you have dignity. You have majesty. You want to be perceived in a respectable way. And sometimes looking in a respectable way makes you feel more dignified. If you see yourself as a queen or a king, generally speaking, your attitudes also are under the microscope. And you look at yourself, it doesn't pass. How does it pass for a kvuda bas melech prima, or for a king or a prince or a princess, queen, to behave in this fashion? And it's about really valuing every action that you do. And sometimes you need to reinforce that. So I know it's not a direct effect, but it is ultimately the root. The more you respect yourself, the more your behavior is aligned to it. And very often, lack of respect of yourself allows you to become lax and loose and do things that later you're embarrassed of. More things can be said about this, but I want to stop here with this because there's many other things to address. Next question. Psychics, astrologers, and intuition. What is the accepted forum in consulting with credible psychics, astrologers, and intuition? I guess intuition here doesn't mean a person, it just means in general intuition, or people who have intuition. Unfortunately, the past 20 years have been extremely challenging. Yes, we can still write to the Rebbe, daven the oil, or write to Igris. But what if we still don't have clear answers or direction? Speaking to a Rav or Mashpi often do not have the answers that talk to us. I find myself keep asking why. Why me? I was attracted to Chabad Chassidus, the Rebbe through his charisma, emeskite, and leadership. But since Gimel Tammuz 5754, I feel I am treading alone. I have more questions than answers. I feel the need to consult with people who have intuition for direction, support, and advice, even though I feel morally guilty doing so. Another questioner asks, is it right to go to a psychic? Is it right to go to people who are who seem to have a higher sense? Is it alpitera? What about astrologers? What about people who read faces, who read palms, people who read handwriting analysts? The list goes on. Mediums, and so on. So first of all, let's start with halacha. The Torah talks about tomim ti Hashem elekecha, which I'll soon mention the Rebbe brings in general about things like this. Tomim ti Hashem elekecha. Be simple with Hashem elekecha. Tomim is simple, honest, straight, the shortest route, which means don't find all kinds of convoluted and complex ways to solve situations. Tomim. And there's clear heiros, a clear mitzvah avedus, clear prohibitions against going to yadonim and other type of so-called seers and psychics, etc., etc. So number one, you must check with our halacha, with our rav, whether b'chal the thing is mutter. Not even getting now into the philosophy and the chassidus of it. Is it acceptable? Is it right? Even then, even if you find, the question is whether one should go. That's whether one could go, whether one should go. So generally speaking, and I say this with qualification because I am sure there are exceptions, even though I have not found them, and I ask the listening audience, anybody that has a zettel, a note, or a letter that addresses this, please make me aware of it, because I did some research, but I couldn't find an exception. Generally speaking, that I found, the Rebbe generally guides people away from anything like this, based on Tomim Tiyim Hashem Elokech. Sometimes the Rebbe uses the expression called the Poshet MyLife. The simpler approach, the simplest approach is the best one, which means you need betochen in Hashem. Starting to go and look for mediums and so on is, one could question, is it an element of betochen? Because if God wants to give you an answer, He'll find a way to give you an answer. And the Torah tells us what are the general approaches. So you could say, well, maybe He's giving us an answer through these mediums. Well, number one is, how do you establish they're not con artists? When we're vulnerable and emotionally susceptible, it's very easy to believe in things and later be very disappointed. Even if you were to establish, again I said, who says you should? Gimel Tammuz to me doesn't make any change in this regard. To say that before Gimel Tammuz we go to a Rebbe and afterwards Rahman al-Islam replace it with any of these alternatives is ridiculous. The Rebbe answers questions today in his own way. Yes, it's true for our own nefesh habamis, it's nicer to go into Yechidus. But let's be honest, and let's say you couldn't go to the Rebbe, so you're going to go find yourself a psychic. I don't even want to put it in the same breath. So there's an Eibishter in the world, there's a Rebbe, there's the answers that we get, and we have to do it in the simplest approach. Again, here the best is to go to a mashpia and a rav. They may not give you advice like let's say a Rebbe would give advice, but they would give you advice whether it's something you should go to seek out. I find very often from my experience that many people who seek usually run from one to the next, to Kabbalists and so-called Kabbalists, and really it's like a desperate thing. If they stuck with one person their entire life, it's one thing. You see someone running from one to the next, you start wondering, are they taking responsibility for their lives, or they're blaming it on some type of spell or an ayin hara. I know there's a letter from the Rebbe in the Igris, I don't have the letter right in front of me, where parents wrote to the Rebbe that they believe that their daughter has some type of dibuk, or ayin hara, some type of thing. And the Rebbe responded completely rejecting that and said, probably she's doing something inappropriate. She found an inappropriate boyfriend or something like Avazara, the Rebbe said. Why? Why didn't the Rebbe? Maybe there's something taka, some deeper thing. Because in general, let's first call the Pashat MyLife. Let's eliminate the usual suspects. Are you being responsible? Someone will say, listen, I'm not finding a shidduch for all these years. Or some other thing, seems to be there's a curse on me, and I need someone to get rid of this curse. Who says that you tried everything? You're going to determine a subjective person that you tried everything. And again, I'm not trying to be critical of anyone. So often it becomes a desperate attempt because we like exotica. I know as a speaker, I can tell you put into a topic, reading, talking about previous lives, reading the crystal ball of your future, reading your stars. People are drawn to it because it's a very good crutch to escape personal responsibility. Not everyone and not all situations. In the Torah, there's talk about astrology. There's talk about stars. There's talk about even handwriting, reading, and there's talk about face reading and other things like that. But the Torah doesn't make this a derech and avedus Hashem. Because there's power. Yes, the Hashem put powers into certain things. But first you have to go, there's the derech yishara. You have to go to the Tomim Diyat, called Pashat MyLife. If all that's eliminated, and you go to an objective Rav, or Mashpia who understands these things and says, everything's been eliminated, now there's only thing left to go, that's a question. But in most cases, I rarely see a case like that. Most things have not been eliminated, other reasons. Handwriting analysis is probably a different category because it's not as so-called spiritually oriented. It's a science of the way the letters are formed and the direction and so on and so forth. That talk a lot about a person's personality. Is it, again, airtight? We have a Torah. If the Torah wanted, it would have put one of the 613 mitzvahs is to go see a handwriting analyst before you go on a date. Or to find out what their stars are and signs are. Too much leaning on these things ends up becoming an Avodah Zarah type of thing, at least a borderline, conceptual. There's one God, he runs the show. Yes, he uses many kagazim biyad hachetzev, he uses many different forces like tools, like an artist uses a brush. But to start worshiping the brush and forget about the artist is definitely not the Torah way. And we don't want to lose sight of the destination. You don't want to get stuck on stations, which is why we don't worship stars, etc. So overall, the answer is avoid it as much as possible. If you have a real situation, then ask someone that's objective. And in most cases, it's probably hard to find out whether a person is for real or not for real. Generally speaking, there are more con artists out there than there are real ones. So even if there are real ones, you could probably say guilty until proven innocent. Not in a court of law. Because most people doing it, especially if they're charging money, is usually a sign there may be some biases and so on. Does it exist? Yes. Doesn't mean necessarily we have to go pursue it. And again, if anybody has direct answers that can help, I'd be more than happy to first of all, I'd be delighted to receive them, and I'd be happy to share it. Whatever we find, we will definitely use. Now I want to use the rest of this episode to talk about a follow-up to the issue of chinuch, limud chayil, and so on. And also fill in some little gaps that I did not address in previous episodes. I want to begin, first of all, a few things that I said. So this is now the fourth, believe it's the fourth time I'm speaking about it. This is episode 27. I began in episode 24, speaking about it. We spoke about the Rebbe's battle against Tachlis, and I want to address that a little more. We spoke about the Tanya Perek Ches, and we learned it inside. And then we spoke last week about the issues, how that applies to what the Rebbe expects of us. I want to just sum up one critical point and then just fill in some gaps. I want to read a sikha also as well from Eikev Tavshim Mem Ches. Let me just pull it out from the shelf here. Sorry about that, but we need to look at it inside. Okay. So the main thing, and this I think just to sum up, sometimes arichas things get lost. The Rebbe and Chassidus in general, Chassidus Applied, comes to teach us and trains us to think in context of Das Elyon. Let's use that word. The world, the material world, thinks everything from the bottom up. How does science work? How does wisdom work? Just like a little child takes a clock, opens it up, and sees what makes it tick. We go Mamatul Lamayla. Das Tachten sees a universe and then extrapolates and tries to understand what put it here. So we try to understand the what of existence. Das Elyon sees it from the perspective of God. what did God intend with creating the world? What did God intend in creating this clock? What did God intend in creating you and I? This is what Chassidus comes to do. Torah in general. Torah is what? It's chem de gnuza. It's chachmasiv v'retzein shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The wisdom and the desire and will of God. And it's essentially giving us a blueprint of existence the way the Torah sees it. These are very different perspectives, and they clash. Now, the important thing to mention here is that we're being trained, Torah in general, as I said, Chassidus in particular, and the Rebbe in particular. So this is a fundamental principle that affects us all to see the world in a different way. That's why I said we have to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. For us to succumb, even al pitei to find a heter, to be part of the world, that's not why we were sent here. We were sent to change the world. So it's a das elyon. But the thing is, das elyon, not to remain in heaven and look at it from the Rekiah Hashvi. Das elyon should inform das tachten, that the way we think, the way we act, the way we speak, the way we behave in the material world, from the things that we do, mitzvahs, to divrei reshus, to work and business, should be saturated, should be informed, and should be directed by das elyon. So yes, this is a very unique and a gift that we were given. So you were given a gift, your neshama comes down to earth to introduce a higher perspective on everything in life. And you become part of the thing you were supposed to inform. You have now forgotten why you came, and you're now here and become part of existence that you were supposed to train. Now it's training you, or you've become hostage to it. That's what we're talking about here. That's why this isn't a small matter. It's basically the whole foundation of our lives. And if you look at the sikhs, and I'll just quote a few more specifically, this is the essence. So before I get to that, I just want to follow up a few points. I mentioned the story a few weeks back about the circle and the dot in the center. So actually, the story that Rebbe told to a person, the key thing, all knowledge is the circle. But the center is the purpose of life. Like someone wrote to me, secular wisdom teaches you vos. Torah teaches you farvos. Secular wisdom talks about existence, what the metzius of the world is. And Torah teaches you what is beyond the world, how you transform the world as beyond, and don't see the world as a given. In the language of Chassidus, Torah teaches you elikus b'pshitus. God is reality, and the world is a novelty. The world teaches, even wisdom of the world teaches, the world is reality, and God is the novelty. As Chassidus says, yesh ma'ayin. What's the yesh? Yesh amiti, is God real, and this is ayin? Or is this yesh, and that's ayin, as an unknown? And that's what's at stake here. And that's why the Rebbe went to war literally in educating us, to teach our children from the youngest of age to know the center. You first build the foundation, then you build the floors above it. These are analogies that the Rebbe brings in places. So, to fill in some gaps in Torah Shalom, in Sikh of Yutas Kis of Tafresh Pei, the last year of the Rebbe Rashab's Chaim Chayusi Baal Medain, page 244, he talks about this, the difference between Aristotle and the Rambam that I mentioned last week. Eagle and the center, the difference between the Kuda and the eagle around it. That Aristotle began with the eagle around it and looked for the center, the hub, the focal point. And the Rambam began with the focal point and then went out to the center. And also the famous story that you hear from Ashpiyim and so on, that when Aristotle behaved in a way that was inconsistent with his philosophies, he says, now I'm not Aristotle. Bertrand Russell, another philosopher, later, more contemporary one, did something immoral. And he was called in by the board of his university. He said, you're a professor of morality, how can you act like that? He says, I also teach mathematics and I'm not a triangle. Contrast that with what? With the Rambam in Hilchos Deis, where he says that how do you know who's a wise person? You don't look at their oratory skills, at their brilliance, at their exposition, at their mind, brain power, their IQ. You look at how they eat and how they drink, and how they walk and how they talk and how they sleep and how they deal with small matters. Because in Torah, yes, you are what you teach and you teach what you are. It's not this, I'm not a triangle. Obviously, none of us are perfect, but to make that and aspire to it, an academic world where we say, actually, it doesn't even matter. I'm brilliant in the idea. Don't look at what I do. Look at what I teach. In Torah, it's all about the tachlis of Chochmah, Maisim Tevim, Reishis Chochmah Yiras Hashem. The whole idea is about changing this world. And these stories just captured. I'm just filling in a little more about things that we talked about. So bottom line, Das Tachten tolerates duality, maybe even advocates duality. Das Elyon advocates unity, everything toward a purpose, toward a direction. Consistency between your mind and your actions. That's how the Rebbe wanted us to look. So, a few other things in this context. I want to read Ha'ara in Eikev Tavshin Mem Ches. As a sikha I had the schus to prepare. It's a tremendous Ha'ara from the Rebbe in this sikha of Eikev, where he talks about Torah. So he says in the Prim, I'm reading on page 590 in Sefer HaSichos Tavshin Mem Ches. He says like this. Alle Sachen in Welt, everything in the world, I'll translate it, I won't read the Yiddish. You can look it up. It starts on 589 and goes to 590 in this context. Everything in the world exists first in the Torah. God looked into the Torah as a blueprint, and with that he created the world. Okay, this is something we're very familiar with. According to that, according to the blueprint, the Torah, that's how they were created. So there's no such thing in the world, the Rebbe says, that Chaz v'Sholem, Torah has not something to say about it. Because everything that exists started in the blueprint. So the blueprint has to say something. It doesn't have any place else to be created if it's not in the blueprint. It's like looking at a building that was built by an architect and there's an extra room. Where'd that extra room come from? It has to be in the blueprint somewhere. So everything in the world has a heirah, as a directive, how the Torah says you should behave with it. And the Rebbe then says Ha'ara. In Ha'ara 10, on 590, in Sefer HaSichos Tavshin Mem Ches, volume 2. V'yiseirim ezeh, ha'teira megala amitis ha'metzias v'tachlis shall kol davar. The Torah reveals the true nature and purpose of everything. How that thing is b'sharshei u'mekere b'teira. From where it was created by God. Through the Asias, the letters of the 10 Maimoris, and their tziruf mechilufim, as he explains in Shai Yochid V'Amun. Hainu, sha'ashimish ba'adovet tzorech liyas masim la'amitis mitziyoseh. That means the use of this object, or this phenomenon, the function of it, has to be consistent to its true nature, and its true being, as it's in the world, is when you use it for what the Torah directs it. So just to use an example that it doesn't say here. God said, it says in the Medrash that God created gold only for the Mishkan, but for Bechira he allows gold to be used for other purposes. The Rebbe uses this about technology in Mishpatim Tavshin Mem Daled. Talks about Tanya on the radio. So what does this mean? You want to know what's the true nature of gold? It was created in order to sanctify it in a Beis HaMikdash. To say that gold is being used for something else, that's Das Tacht. Das Elyon says, look how what the Torah says it's for, and everything has, and that's its true use. Now God also allows us to use it also for other things, Rishus. Listen to this. And if you don't use it the way the Torah says, it's not just you're doing something not God according to Torah, and Hepech Rotzen Hashem, and against God's will, God forbid. You're actually defying the very nature and personality of the thing itself. It's a tremendous concept. Everything in this world. The Rebbe actually goes on and explains that this is nishtalshel, that's why also science works this way. To understand the true muhus and tchuna of a thing, you don't just look at the object, the symptoms, you look at the causes. The essence of technology is to understand the laws of nature that shape nature. That the Rebbe is saying in the nishtalshel from the way from Torah, that everything is rooted in Torah. Ela b'chochmas ha'umah is in the wisdom of the nations. How does it gashmi? There, you're only learning about the physical source. For example, how do we tap into create a microchip through understanding the microscopic particles of subatomic energy? quantum mechanics. And through Torah, you also distinguish, you can recognize in the spiritual root. And through that, you understand the purpose for which it was created. Klor, difference between Torah and Chochmas HaOmes. Here I mentioned that Rebbe, it said, the Rebbe took out the Gam and just left the B'shar Sheharuchni, which we can learn much from, which is why you ultimately go to a doctor to heal. Because if the Torah also gives you the Gashmi's Dika root, then only Torah. But Torah does leave room for the scientist and for human beings to figure out things mamata lamaila. But if you want to know the purpose, the center, the foundation, then you have to Torah. So this brings me to the question, to the sikha that I mentioned, but I want to elaborate a little more. The sikhas, two sikhas in Tafshin Tezvav. We're talking now 1954 and 55. 54 because it was Simchas Torah, and 55 Yud Shvat. So Simchas Torah, Yom Simchas Torah, Yud Tafshin Tezvav, and Yud Shvat Tafshin Tezvav are two sikhas where the Rebbe lays out passionately foundations of education, and especially to children. I would recommend everyone reads this, because this also answers another question a lot of people ask, why the Rebbe didn't intervene directly in the Moedas Chinuch to make them much better than they are. He did. Read the Sikha. The only thing is the Rebbe couldn't go to the school itself and talk to each principal and teacher. He said very clearly the statements here. The bottom line principle in both these Sikhas is, let's start with the number one thing with children. You want to teach children, the Rebbe says, number one, not knowledge, not even knowledge and Torah. You want to teach them to be Yirei Shamayim, to know there's a God in this world, to know the foundation, the Rebbe says, the Yesod. Sadly, the Rebbe says, the schools, even our good schools, are using the time, instead of teaching these foundations, they're teaching them side things, including Limudei Chel. What is the battle here against Limudei Chel? Not that we shouldn't know math and penmanship or other things like that. You're taking away the foundation of a young, impressionable mind. It's to teach them there's a God. You only have one chance to do that. It's so much harder to do it later. Like one wise person said, it's infinitely easier to educate a young child than to fix a broken adult. The Rebbe goes to war of how we shape lives. How do we create a Das Elyon individual? How do we create someone who's going to be drafted in God's army, in the Rebbe's army, to change the world and not become part of the world? You do that at the youngest age. If you understand the kavanah of what the Rebbe wants, the whole thing makes sense. The Rebbe is not coming to knock education. He's coming to focus what is the foundation and what's an instrument. You don't want children to master how to use a hammer and a screwdriver before they understand why there's a hammer and screwdriver in the world in the first place. Then the instruments follow. So the Rebbe says, in answering the question, what is actually the age? Here's a question. I'm going to read a few questions, as many as I can, and then I'll continue rest in the next episode. What is the exact age to start teaching? So in Simchas Torah, I'm just reading directly. I want to read straight from the Rebbe's own words because I don't want to interpret it. The Rebbe says like this, Simchas Torah I'm reading. Erste 3 Jahr, wenn ein Kind hebt an lernen, das ist die Zeit, was jemalt ist der ganze Yesod, soll matzliach sein auf später. The first 3 years that a child begins to study, that's the Yesod, the foundation, that lays, that he will succeed the rest of it later as well. You educate a child his way, also he gets older, he doesn't waver from it. Is nennt man dem Kind, man ist mit Tame, the Meach mit English, Grammarke, that's grammar, Halavai wollten Gräse echt nicht gewusst von dem. Heit me koschen a Kind bis 9 Jahr, bis 12 Jahr, und ich wollte sagen, ich weiter nur te fasten, maar über Leute fasten. So basically the Rebbe is saying, not to contaminate, he says the first 3 years, wait till age 9, maybe age 12, and later too, but I can't grasp everything. You don't grab everything. You don't bite off more than you can chew, so to speak. Don't grab everything because then you end up not grabbing anything. So many wonder, what does this mean? Does he want children not to know how to read, how to speak? Well, we know that Rebbe wanted people to go to shuls and chazer Chassidus, and obviously the language of the people to get up and chazer in Yiddish or in French or in Spanish or in Hebrew when people speak English is not going to work. We also know there are basics, but to make it a worship it, like he says in the Sikha of Yud Shvat, he talks about the klippa of America is tachlis. Tells a whole story with the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe, when one of his grandchildren got married, one of the gifts he got was a special hat that was like the modern type of hat. It was a gift that had a special type of fur. And the Alter Rebbe saw that, so he told him that if you cut off this part, you'll be you will be with me together in my mechitza, meaning in the world to come, in the same department, so to speak, in the same area. So Einikel said, do I have to actually feel that, or did I just do it because you said so? So the Rebbe says, Vaystays, that's how it stayed, because he didn't hold that it's emes yet. And later, this Einikel went to cry in Hadich, where the Alter Rebbe's tzion is, that he did not realize that it should have been right away feel it beprimis. The Rebbe uses it that what was the Frierdiker Rebbe explained, what was the problem? What's wrong with having a hat? It wasn't us, it didn't do something prohibited, but the Alter Rebbe saw that was the klippa of the time. And the klippa of the time was this modern fashion. The klippa of our time, the Rebbe says in the Sikh at the end of Yud Shvat Tovshin Tezvav, is tachlis. The worship that you must get a secular education in order to be successful in this world. That's a klippa. Then he goes to a second klippa, he calls it pirsum, that everything has to be PR, publicity. That's not for now. So he says the war has to be tachlis. He actually speaks about the bochrim to dedicate their lives to Torah. He developed then a keren Torah to help support. The Rebbe was not advocating ignorance or illiteracy. He was advocating the focus that you should have people who have clear-headed what is Das Elyon, that they should come to change the world and not be part of the world. You can read the Sikha on your own. There's a lot of fascinating lines there, tremendous lines. He talks about the yeshiva system. He talks about educators who focus more on in the Kiyashvi and deep Biyurim and Rambam and not teaching children and students the Yesodus of Yiras Shamayim and of Hashgacha Pratis and there's a God and so on. You have to read it. It's a tremendous, I think, directive. If we built our schools just following the Sikha of Yud Shvat Tovshin Tezvav, we'd have many problems solved. As I said a number of times, Chassidus Applied. The whole point is look into the Rebbe's words and let's just follow it. And if you follow it, you'll find Hatzlacha, Begashmis, and Beruchnis. The Rebbe talks at length about the Parnasa issue as well. So with that said, let me just read as much as I can with the time allowing. Questions about the age that children should learn and what they can learn. Pertaining to the Limudei Chel series you're teaching now, my Yetzer Hara asks, when did the Rebbe want our chinuch to be al Taharas HaKodesh and not to waste time going to college? This is during the time when we should all be spending our time in Hafotza. I'm referring to a case that a bocher in his 20s and Hashkofet Tznius and Tachlis are not the issue. But nowadays, when most of us will not be able to go to we could be shluchim, and probably a small minority of us will, then we are no longer wasting our time by going to college or instituting limudei chel. Is this not somewhat true? This is assuming that the Rebbe had a plan in mind when he insisted we not waste time going to college, but nowadays, batla sibon is batla mesubov, which means when the cause is not there, the effect is not there. Well, my friend, let me tell you, the Rebbe wanted to train all of us to think with Das Elyon eyes. Whether you call it shliach, or whether you call it official or not official, this is what the Rebbe came to do. And nobody is immune. Nobody is off the reservation in this regard. It's teaching you no matter what you do. Even if you end up going to work, I'm not getting now why people make different choices, is to look at your work from a Das Elyon perspective. That's what I was emphasizing. If not, what do we need a Torah? What do we need a Chassidus? What do we need the Rabbeim? What, to just tell us that we should follow Shulchan Aruch? That's a dover pashut. They came to teach us a perspective of a different way of looking at the universe. They're looking at yourself, looking at existence. So there's no batla sibah, there's no batla mesubav. That remains. If you learn Tanya Pedach Ches, it's not because you go on shlichus, so you don't need limudei chel because you can make money by raising money for your Chabad house. No, it's a perspective that you're here to change the world. You want to do it in your workplace? Fine. That's what the Rebbe expects of us. Limud Chayil is an instrument at best. It's a tool. Sometimes you could hire someone for that. Some of us will never be accountants, lawyers, and doctors. And yet we need that in life. You need an accountant to be able to do your books, a bookkeeper. Some of us hire people to write letters for us. Why suddenly, when it comes to business, we're constantly hiring all kinds of third parties, and suddenly here we say, no, I have to do it myself. Yourself here is that you have to be a soul doctor. You have to be a Das Elyon visionary. Doesn't mean you all have to be philosophers, but you have to look at the world, like he speaks at length, that the first thing is that there's a God. The first thing is a purpose. And now we come into a world and figure out how the world fulfills the purpose. Not the first thing there's a world and then figure out how God fits in. So this remains universal. This is the foundation of all of Torah, all of Chassidus, and all of the Rebbe. So there's no change at all in this. It manifests in different ways. So whatever you're doing this Das Elyon introduction to the universe, you're fulfilling what the Rebbe wants. There's obviously ways to do it in a more optimal way. It's much easier sometimes to do it when you're a full-time shliach in that sense. But on the other hand, as we read the Hayom Yom, there's an advantage of doing it as a business person. What exactly, in question number 2, is the Rebbe's opinion about teaching children any English secular subjects such as reading, math, basic penmanship? These are functional subjects needed today. I would say, based on the Sikh in Yud Shvat, if you're worshiping the tool chest and you're missing the foundation, then that's what has to be the focus. But if someone knows there's a foundation, obviously a building also has floors. So I don't see the Rebbe negating. They say in France, Rab Nissen, who definitely was no secular education, they taught the Talmidim French. They taught them basic skills. So bring a tutor in. But it's clear you're teaching the tool. That's all you're teaching, an instrument. At what age? I read, whether it's 9, whether it's earlier. Look, let's be honest. Even if you don't give any education to children, they're going to be speaking English before 9 years old because most people speak English. They're going to be picking it up. So, but in replacing, the foundation is only one. There's no 2 foundations. The foundation is God's plan for the world. The foundation is that you are an agent of God's. You're a Das Elyon agent of God's. And then come the instruments. If it's in that context, guaranteed it's case by case. I can't say there's a black and white. You have the Rebbe's words that I read. But it comes down to basic common sense. Who your child is. Your child loves reading. What are you going to do? Stop them from picking up any book? It's going to be impossible. Find the right books. I know people that didn't go necessarily to secular education, but they read everything, and they're tremendous writers and successful and so on. Because time is run out, I was going to read a few more questions in this regard, and now answer them more specifically after we've covered all the more fundamental elements. So I just want to conclude this episode 27. This has been MyLife, Chassidus Applied, episode 27. Please continue sending your questions in to meaningfullife.com/MyLifeLive, and personally to me, Simon at meaningfullife.com, if you want a response or in any way to contact me. Everyone should have a very peaceful week. There should be shalom in Eretz Yisrael, real shalom. There should be shalom b'chol ha'olam kulei. And these days, Yehovcha Yom Meil l'sasun l'simcha l'moedim tevim, with Mashiach Tzidkenu, when Tisha B'Av will be the greatest holiday of them all. This has been MyLife, Chassidus Applied, episode 27. So until next Sunday, 8 to 9 p.m., everyone should have a very blessed week.